So my name is Bavesh Kana. I direct the Center of Excellence for TB Research. That's based here at Wits University. The center really has a couple of things that it looks at when it comes to tuberculosis. The first is looking for new TB drugs. If you look, we use TB drugs that have been developed 50 or 60 years ago to treat patients today, and one of the reasons for that is that TB has primarily been a disease of the poor. And so there's been poor historic investment by pharmaceutical companies and governments to develop new drugs. And so that's one of the main things we focus on, finding new TB drug targets so that these can be worked up into new TB drugs and new TB regimens. The second thing that we work on that's quite interesting and has important implications for people who have tuberculosis is this idea that people with TB need to get treated for a very long time. So a person with drug-susceptible tuberculosis has to be treated for 6 months. I had a very interesting childhood. So I came from a family of Indian farmers. So my dad's parents immigrated from India sort of around the 1940s, 1950s, just post the independence in India. And they came to South Africa, and unlike many Gujarati people who came to South Africa at the time, who started shops and were very entrepreneurial, my dad stayed true to his heritage of farming. And so we were one of the few farming families in the community. My dad, as I grew up, my dad he was a hawker. He used to hawk vegetables, and then eventually started his own business. He used to export vegetables. He grew it to quite a size that he was exporting vegetables to Europe. And then he closed that. The business wasn't working, and he went back to farming. And I just entered my teenage years at the time. And it was very difficult, I think, being a farmer in those days. It was difficult for him to own land. So the way we farmed was we would lease land from farmers who had sort of abandoned their land or had no use for it. So we often found ourselves driving every day to far-flung areas to find farming land. And so most of my teenage years were spent driving to Rustenburg. We had a farm in Rustenburg. We would get up very early in the morning, it's around 4 o'clock. We'd drive to Rustenburg, we'd work on the farm, we'd load up whatever we managed to grow. We were vegetable farmers. We'd get it onto our little van and we'd take it to the market and then come home. And that was a wonderful childhood, growing up amongst farms, being in nature. But it was interesting because that was my first association with tuberculosis. So we were a very small farming community. We had a group of farm workers who always moved with us whenever we shifted around and went to different farms. And often you'd see people go home and not come back. And I would ask my mom, what happened to this person? And she'd say, well, they got tuberculosis. And I remember at the time just thinking this disease was the thing that was taking the people away from my life. I didn't quite understand it at the time, but it was like kind of this thing that took away people I cared for. And that was my first awakening that, as I grow older and as I choose a career, I'd like to do something for health. I'd like to do something to improve the lives of people who work on farms. I'd like to do something to improve the lives of people who have no access to good health care, because we could see it on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, growing up, becoming a doctor was all I could think about. And I must admit, it was a very enchanting view of life, to be taken away from the farm, to be taken away from the rural areas, and to go and be a flashy doctor. But I was not a strong academic. I struggled in school. I particularly struggled with maths and science. I did well enough to pass, but I recall in my last year of school, so that was matric, nowadays it's grade 12, I had this growing sense of foreboding that I'm probably not going to do very well. But I did my best. I passed matric, but I did not get into medicine. And I think, like many people who burl themselves up wanting to do medicine and be doctors, I was completely devastated. It was like my life was over. This was my dream, and I wasn't going to be able to live it. But then I got admitted to a degree in science, and that's the one thing I would say to people. Like, you often have dreams, you often have things that you want to do, but then life gives you some choices, and you have to choose amongst that, right? And so I thought this degree in science was a great opportunity. And many of us who didn't get into medicine at that time thought, well, we'll do a science degree and then we'll get into medicine afterwards. It's a common thing that people want to do. So I started this science degree. I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do a science degree and I'm going to get into medicine. But that didn't work out well either. So my first year was horrible. I felt very unprepared for life, right? I came from a school that was not well resourced, and I was sitting in these lecture theatres, and there were people who knew more than me. There were people who were better educated than me. They spoke with greater authority, and I just shrank slowly. I just shrank within myself, and it was a very tough year. And I finished it not academically strong. I actually failed maths. I just barely managed passing everything else, and I thought, that's it, my university career is over. But of course, paying for university was challenging, and I was hoping to actually do so well that I would get a bursary, and that didn't work out. But eventually I managed to get some loans, and I registered for my second year. But this time I started off the year understanding that I needed a lot of help, and so I was very lucky. I found somebody in the maths department, a PhD student, who agreed to help me, and she was very generous. She tutored me during lunchtimes, and someone in the chemistry department who also agreed to help me. And it was with the help of these wonderful people at the university, I was able to do very well. So I passed my second year, and then I got into my third year, and I did so well that I got bursaries afterwards. I was getting A's all the time. And in the end, when I graduated as the top student in the School of Biology. So I went from failing to being academically successful. So a microbiologist, as the name implies, micro. We look at tiny little things. We look at either bacteria, and recently, because of coronavirus, we've started to study viruses too. And so, the job of a microbiologist is really to study how these little bacteria and viruses live. How they grow, how they divide, what they need for nutrients, what they need to survive and transmit to other individuals. And that knowledge is incredibly fundamental when we think about ways of killing these organisms. One big area of microbiology is also trying to understand how these microbes, bacteria and viruses, how they interact with humans. And when they interact with humans, we have an immune system, and you get an immune response. How can we understand that immune response? And together, understanding that immune response and understanding how the bugs live and die allow us to develop drugs, and they allow us to develop vaccines. Science is wonderful, right? Because your team is about as big as you make it, right? So we have a core team here in the lab. The majority of them are microbiologists too. So a fair amount of what we do is microbiology, but we generate a lot of interesting data that then calls on the expertise that's sort of outside of our group, right? So we also work with computational biologists who look at interesting things like single cell data. We generate images of single cell TB bacteria. We stain them with very interesting dyes that tell us interesting things about how they're growing and how they're dying. And so we use high content learning approaches here, machine learning approaches, so we deal with computational biologists. In our clinical work, we generate a lot of data from people, and so for that we work with biostatisticians. We also do a lot of gene sequence work, so there we deal with bioinformatics people. There's also a lot of omics type technologies, so sequencing, doing genomics. We deal with individuals who are experts in that. And then there's also sort of the more social aspect of what we do. So there we deal with the people in humanities, so people who look at behavioral aspects of how people, health-seeking behavior of individuals. So it's actually very, very, when you think of how you contribute to science, it's very broad than just the specific traditional scientific disciplines. Today's science is a multi-integrative thing that many people in many different disciplines contribute to. So our team's quite big. We're very focused here in the lab, but our team itself is quite big.
My name is Ofentse Matlhabe. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center of Excellence for Biomedical TB Research. The reason I chose this career path is because I've always been interested in biology. And when I got to university, initially I wanted to do virology. But then over time, I was interested in this lab because they do TB research. And at that time, I found out that TB is the #1 killer in South Africa, and I wanted to be part of the solution.
So a typical day at work usually involves me coming into the lab, and the first component of my day is around administration. So that's making sure that the labs are running properly. We run these containment laboratories. These are very specialist labs that allow us to grow dangerous things, such as tuberculosis or COVID. We're now growing SARS-CoV-2. And making sure these labs are operating properly, and thereafter the students start coming into the lab, and then I usually walk through the lab and stop by and say, is everything going okay, how's your project coming along? Are you running into any problems? Sometimes the students have found some interesting papers, or they want to discuss something with me, so they pull me aside and we have very interesting scientific discussions. And then I also speak to the senior members of my team to see how their projects are going. And then the rest of the day goes through a mixture of meetings, calls, engaging on science and also engaging on higher levels of activities in the university. I serve on several committees in the university. So I started my PhD here at Wits, and I've had lots of opportunities to travel. So as part of my PhD, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and it was wonderful. You just see a different world, a different way. And you must imagine, I was off the farm. And and I went to Pennsylvania, and you see this whole new world, and it was a very enriching experience. But I came back, I completed my PhD, and then as part of my postdoc, I went back to the US. I spent a bit of time at Texas A&M University, and I would say that these travel experiences have been very enriching. I think it's really one of the pull factors for a career in science, because you engage with people at an academic level. It's very open, it's very free-flowing, and you grow a lot as an individual. I cultivated my love for opera. I used to go to all the operas when I lived in New York. So I think it's important to recognize how much COVID has changed the world. We hear that there's a new normal, there's nothing like post-COVID, but I think for us as South Africans, it's highlighted some serious gaps in the way our society works, right? And a good example of this was vaccines, right? So vaccines were initially developed. They were actually trialed here in South Africa, and then the people who developed them took them away and said, well, we're giving them to these countries, and you South Africans, you're going to have to work out what you do, right? And I think that fundamentally speaks to our value system and how we should look forward when we think about science, technology, innovation. When we think about how we invest in these spaces, we have to, if we don't want to relive what we've been through in the last 2 years as a society, we have to move towards A, valuing science, B, valuing innovation, right? A lot of the science that we do has to move towards innovation, and then these innovations have to move towards products. We have to become a country, a society that produces our own medicines, that produces our own vaccines. We have to become people that are proud of the science that we do here in South Africa, because it helps South African communities. And I think that has got to be almost in a way a not negotiable. If we move forward as a society, we never want to relive the last 2 years. We want to be poised to be able to respond better. So I guess the first thing I would say is, do not be afraid to fail. Growing up, failure is just something that we all taught to be afraid of, right? We all taught to be ashamed of. If you do something and it doesn't go right, or if you do something and it doesn't go the way somehow you failed, and there's a shame associated with it. And the combination of those two things, the fear and the shame, creates such a barrier that it's very difficult to move across. And so what I would say is, you're going to fail. I failed. I still fail today. We fail all the time. But I don't think one should let that failure define you. My own experience is, what does define you is what you do after you fail. Don't hold on to things too tightly, right? Be flexible enough in how you see the world and how you engage with the world to be able to identify new opportunities, right? So don't build things up too big in your head, right? It's a wonderful time of your life. Your whole life's ahead of you, right? Have an open mind, right? Explore all opportunities, and take every opportunity that comes. You never know. You can never see the end of all things, right? Sometimes you don't know where something is going. I'll give you an example. We were growing these bacteria in the lab for the longest time, and we didn't understand where was this going. And eventually it led to a series of products that are now being distributed throughout the world. So that will take me to the final thing, and that is, focus on what's in front of you, but focus on being excellent. The world is unforgiving like that. And the only way you rise to the top is to be completely excellent at what you do, right? Don't be distracted. Be in the here and now, and focus on being super excellent, and success will chase you. Success will just come running behind you.